Mhm. Hello, I think I'm on. I hope so. I'm recording this too. Hello, I'm back. This is lecture 3 for 810. It's actually Sunday evening instead of Monday. I actually have to give a lecture at Yale tomorrow, but I won't be at Yale. I'll be on a Zoom, but it'll be synchronous, so I have to actually be there at the same time as other people. So I thought I would come over and tell you about Heart of Darkness on my Sunday evening. So you'll want to look at this tape in conjunction with the text that's under discussions under lecture 3. My tapes are meant to animate the text that's listed, the printed text. So the printed text is something you can print out and you can highlight and you can go over it, and it's quite detailed. And I don't want to use this live format to go over the same details necessarily. I'd rather, this is what I do if this were live and we were all in the same room, is just animate it, bring up other examples, try and make it sort of an everyday discourse and not too textbooky. But so when students say, "Well, I'm nervous," the tape was fun and interesting and thought provoking, but wasn't sure how to take notes. I'm not sure you totally have to take notes on this taped stuff. Not least of all because it's taped. You can replay it. You can stop. I mean, students often say I talk too fast, but now you have a pause button. But I don't. But I resist the urge to like somehow write down everything I'm saying in some kind of transcript. If you take notes while you're listening to the tape, especially the first time, you can hit pause and write down a few notes when something I say resonates with you. Don't just write it down because I said it. Write it down because you heard it. Uh, and so if I make a connection to Dorian Gray and Heart of Darkness that resonates with you, that's worth hitting pause and noting it because that's going to sort of enliven your own ability to move between and among these texts. And that is what gets tested on the midterm in a way when I give you the 4 uh, quotes. And during the Wednesday open hour, I kind of worked over the quote of nowadays, the price of, and I'll do some more of that this coming Wednesday in the open class, 11 to 12. So you can tune in for that. Maybe I'll grab a quote or two from Heart of Darkness and just work it over as what kind of things, what could you do with this if it were to show up on the midterm in relation to the frame question. So the price of everything and the value of nothing. Well, it turns out we may not know the price of things as much as we thought either. Heart of Darkness, I have said, is the geopolitical equivalent of the psychological allegory that's in Dorian Gray. So Dorian Gray, 1890, Heart of Darkness, 1900. So only 10 years separate these two. And but with Dorian Gray, the emphasis is very much on how a sort of an unanchored self, no longer with an essentialist concept of a soul that corresponds to an omniscient God, has become increasingly prey to anything that it can connect to give it a sense of worth and a sense of value. Dorian Gray will say to Sybil Vane, and this will cause her suicide, Without your art, you're nothing. And we should note that in saying that to her, he's really just doing a brutal equivalent of what Lord Henry said to him, to Dorian Gray. Without your charm, without how handsome you are, you will be nothing. So he doesn't quite say you are nothing, but he's like, well, you will be, because you're not going to be able to stay young. And that freaks out uh, uh, Dorian Gray. And just adjusting my light a little bit. I don't know. That is better. And Dorian Gray wishes for the painting to stay the same. And what we get in Dorian Gray is his panic of an 18-year-old who's been ignored, who's essentially hasn't been raised by anybody, or if he has, only the necessities of life. Nobody's ever reflected back to Dorian Gray any sense of how he might have value other than what he can do for other people, looking handsome or being charming and making them feel better about themselves. So it's natural that that's how he falls in love with Sybil Vane. But what we also see in Dorian Gray is that this self construct is like a bucket with a hole in it. You can fill it, but it leaks out. You can connect it to something, but it wants more. And we talked about, and we'll talk more about this, the Pepsi myths, the progress, sufficiency, perfection, satisfaction, innovation, and how all of those myths are myths of deferral. And they're as important to our time as myths of Apollo were to the Greeks, because they orient us. They help us organize the reality around us. And organizing the reality so that you can recognize patterns is not to say that you understand everything that's real. It means that you've got a map. Maps are a big deal in Hearted Artists. If you notice, he recalls being a boy looking at maps and longing to go to the white spaces, which would have been a lot of Africa. And of course they aren't. He calls them blank spaces, and they're not blank. I mean, there's a land there. There are people there. There's customs and tribes, and but from the imperial point of view, there's nothing there because they're not there yet. And in a way, Sybil Vane is like a blank space on the map for Dorian Gray. I mean, she's already someone. I mean, she's not sure who she is, but she's an actual individual. Dorian Gray has decided what she is, and when he does it, and when she's not that, or when she's more than that, or when she's other than that, he just wants to wipe her out, because otherwise he's in danger of realizing the degree to which he is a pale reflection of himself. And there's a similar moment among many with Kurtz. Kurtz is a little like Basil Hallward in the sense that he is idealistic. He thinks he can do well. He thinks he can better the world, but he doesn't look very closely at the world. The world, his idealism completes him. And so when things fall short of the ideal for Kurtz, he just doesn't see it. And Basil was a lot like that. That Dorian was perfect, and Dorian made him feel like he could do his best art. And that's all Dorian was, and he wouldn't see anything else. And he was, in a sense, a blank space. And Kurtz's version of that is, when he first goes to the Congo, he's been asked by this organization called the Suppression of Savage Customs, which already shows how prejudiced the point of view is coming from the West into Africa, which is you're all savages. You don't have a god. What you claim to be a god is just fantasy. It's just made up. You don't know our one true God, so you're godless savages. You're a blank space. You have no history. You have no religion. You have no culture. You have no identity. You have no humanity. That is the imperial gaze. The imperial gaze sees a blank space wherever it wants to fill itself with an image of itself. And there's no room for anything there to be acknowledged as having a prior existence. So, and you'll see this in the way that Marlowe talks about the Congo. The Congo, it's never called the Congo, it's never even called Africa, but Conrad himself did a very similar time in the Congo where he also had a boat that he was supposed to take upriver that he had to repair to find a sick head of what was called an inside station, and that the man he picked up to bring back because died on the way. So that much literally happened with Conrad himself. Uh, that was a man named Klein, not Kurtz, but clearly the inspiration. Uh, but Marlowe is always talking about the inscrutable forest, the brooding forest, the gloomy forest, over and over and over. And part of this is more about Marlowe than the forest. Um, what's overwhelming to Marlowe and what will essentially crush Kurtz is that the jungle and the forest and the inscrutable savages, as they're called, is outside the scope of the imperialist vision. And the way Kurtz deals with that is he sees anything outside the imperialist vision as extraneous, and it doesn't really matter. Marlowe doesn't buy into the imperialist vision, so he's literally looking around trying to make sense of things for himself, and it's impossible. He tries to take the company line, which is that they're doing a lot of progress here, that there's a lot of efficiency here, and it's none of it's true. The nobility of this enterprise is undercut by the terrible people who are just in it, obviously for the money, and they're backbiting, and they don't even just want the ivory; they want the shares. This is the beginning of modern capitalism, where you don't make money with product; you make money with investment. So they would like a share of the profits of the ivory that is being sent back to Europe, because that's where the real money is. They get paid virtually a pittance for being in Africa to trying to extract the ivory. And while there's all this talk about efficiency, the place is a mess. It's not efficient at all. I mean, for instance, he needs rivets. I mean, one place he saw rivets all over the place, but not where he needs them. Later, he'll meet a brickmaker who doesn't make bricks. There's no sand or whatever he needs to make the bricks never arrives. So he sees giant holes full of just trashed machinery. He watches them sort of explode, trying to dynamite their way into mountains in manners that doesn't make sense. So everyone is just grabbing and smashing and trying to get what they can. And none of it's got anything to do with Africa or the well-being of the natives, despite the ideology that this is a win-win. Like the West gets their ivory and Africa gets civilized. It's not happening at all. Yeah, they're building railroads, but only to get the ivory out. It doesn't help the natives at all. They don't need the railroads. Most of the time, the natives have been taken out of what they know, their habitats. And that shocking image where Marlowe comes upon many of them just dying in a grove was a common occurrence. At least 5 million native Africans died in about the 7-year period that the so-called Belgian Congo was up and running, and lots of it was malnutrition. There was no acknowledgement of the different tribes, so people would be chained together who might not even share the same language. The same thing happened with slavery. So also there was this. There was no trade. I mean, the reason the ivory was so profitable is they weren't paying for it, and they weren't really trading anything except this idea, which they promulgated in Europe, that we're bringing them religion and education and roads, and they're going to be so much better off. But in fact, they're being brutally exploited. They're not technically slaves. Slavery was certainly illegal by 1900, even in the U.S. But what happened, the way they extracted labor, they had several ways of doing it, but they would just establish quotas. And this was something that slavery had done with cotton. So X bales of cotton a day, or you'd be whipped. And it was similar with the natives. They were expected to get a certain amount of rubber, and in many cases they would take their families and their children hostage, and just at least threaten in many cases to sell them to other tribes, or to ship them out of Africa, unless the men primarily met their quota of rubber. There was an armed military force to put down rebellions. Uh, Marlowe's got this job because some guy named Freslevin was killed by the natives, and then the natives just left the village immediately because they knew the military would be there to wipe them out. Um, and you get an intimation of what happens to some of the people who go, some of the Europeans who go to Africa, when we're told that Freslevin was like the mildest mannered person anyone had ever met, and then he became some kind of tyrant and had ordered things and possibly rapes and murders, all a bit murky until the natives couldn't do anything else except just rise up, and kill him, uh, and then have to disappear into the jungle before the inevitable retribution. So there's an intimation, especially in the early part of the book, that you go into Africa at your own peril. I mean, you may be quote unquote white, but what does that mean? You know, whiteness is presented as this kind of assumption of superiority, and that's easier to maintain in Europe. But when you go to Africa, what we see with Kurtz certainly is all the assumptions of what whiteness is begin to fall apart. He goes in, you know, remember Yeats's poem is very apt for this book. The center cannot hold, things fall apart, the best lack all conviction. Certainly Marlowe lacks all conviction. The worst are filled with a passionate intensity. Now, Kurtz goes in there as the best. I mean, he's seen as he's the best at getting ivory. He's an idealist. He winds up being one of the worst. And he does have a passionate intensity. It's a little more subtle, perhaps, than Yeats had presented it initially, because Kurtz goes in there to be a good guy. And he becomes one of the worst in his relentless pursuit of trying to get to the other side so that all the terrible things he has done will somehow be redeemed. Because the ideology of this was that, sure, natives are dying, some natives are dying, some things are happening, but we're going to get to this other side eventually. And then the Africans will be civilized and it'll all balance out and it'll all be fine. Notice it's very similar to the Dorian Gray allegory of you know, the painting keeps piling up sin after sin and smirk after smirk and getting uglier and uglier. And Dorian Gray has a kind of unexamined sense that somehow he'll work his way through it all. But in the end, he confronts the portrait and stabs it, and everything that the portrait has been holding on to goes back into him, and he's found dead with the knife in his chest. Very similar to Kurtz on a kind of realistic geopolitical level. Kurtz kept getting worse and worse in an increasingly almost, I'd say, pretty much insane attempt to actualize the faulty myth that once it almost seems like he decided, well, okay, once I've extracted every ounce of ivory from Africa, then somehow this redemption that I tried to buy into to even begin this will come about, and I'll be saved. And one gets the impression that he was stuck with that point of view until literally seconds before he died. Marlowe's clear about that as you know, as death was basically coming upon him, Kurtz couldn't hold on to the ideology anymore. And in this manner similar to Dorian Gray, everything, the awfulness, the pointlessness, ruthlessness of everything he had done, which was nothing but slaughter, he saw it with clarity in the seconds before death, and famously gives the horror, and dies. And one of the things about the novel that I know can be confusing for first readers especially is the reality of what's going on in this novel is impossible to articulate, because articulation, language, culture, tradition, European, can't make sense of what is happening. And not only can't make sense to what's happening to the natives, people can't make sense of what's happening to themselves. Now, Kurtz will go more or less mad and die muttering the horror. Marlowe has a complete nervous breakdown and nearly dies. And he describes walking around London in daze for months. So Africa breaks you, or if it doesn't break you, it's because you're of a particularly worse kind of individual. So the accountant and the manager, um, one guy says, if you come out here, you should have no entrails, and you should have no conscience. We're back to this problem that the accountant is in a beautiful white suit in the middle of the jungle because he beats the woman who has to wash clothes and insists on this whiteness. And that too becomes a symbol that you can't be white enough, literally. So he has to dress all in white and there can't be a spot on it. It's not a coincidence that this is the rise of the soap industry. Um, one of the sayings that got developed was, cleanliness is next to godliness, and what nobody really followed is that as the binary of white and black and racism became more and more developed, so savages were dirty and black and dark and dirty and on and on. In order to emphasize that difference as an excuse for how they were treated, it became more and more important that white people be white and not just, I mean, white skin isn't really white anyway. So the whiteness as purity is really set up in in a distinction against blackness. So here's an important point about any kind of binary, and this is in my text, but let me just draw it out. Binaries always have an implied hierarchy of power. So if you have black and white, one of the terms is going to be presumed to be superior to the other. And this is the ways that language can work to prioritize and privilege. It isn't so much that white people, whoever that is, just decide they're privileged. It's a structure of language, of culture. And its technical name is hegemonic discourse. And hegemonic discourse really means dominant discourse, the way that things are allowed to mean something. Because things don't mean things in and of themselves, they mean something in relation to one another, like as we discussed about value. So if you control the discourse, you can control what is allowed to be meaningful and what is seen as pointless or outside of anything that deserves consideration. In a way, academia is an interesting example of this. Like this, I'm in the English department, and then there's the biology department, there's the physics department. Now, the departments don't fight with each other. The physics department doesn't fight with English, or vice versa. But we have very different ideas of what we are trying to draw out. Like, I don't say that physics has nothing to say, and they don't say that I have nothing to say, but we don't say the same thing. We're not trying to say the same thing. I'm in the humanities, I'm not in physics. So there are things that physics can state as knowledge that aren't coming up in this class, such as the atomic structure, the periodic tables, or on and on. And then there are elements that I talk about in here, like hegemonic discourse, that they would not show up in a physics lecture. And of course, we're in a kind of age of science, or at least we have been. I'll have more to say about this later. I think COVID has brought us to a point that probably we've been moving this way for quite some time. But the age of science seems to be giving way to the age of economics, and on a very simplest level, this trade-off: how much do you lock down for COVID as a health measure versus how much economic loss will you tolerate? And we see that debate raging in the US and a little less so here in Canada. But there is some trade-off going on there. We just have to open up the country. We can't have Wall Street crash. We can't have the economy cave in. We can't do bailouts. We can't seem to get a bill together for that. Kids have to go to school, whether it's safe or not, because parents have to go to work, whether it's safe or not. So it's not that simple, obviously. Everyone wants the kids in school. Everyone wants to go back to work, but there is a lethal virus circulating. So not in my lifetime, at least, has there been such a stark, has economics been put on trial so starkly. And the other shock to the system was to realize how much what makes this world go round is not the stock market at all. It's ordinary workers. I mean, the idea that people being paid minimum wage were on the front line. So running a convenience store had to happen. But if you were a wealthy executive, you didn't necessarily have to go to work. Even if you were a professor, you didn't have to go man a cash till. Not to mention, obviously, nurses and doctors and anyone else front line. But I was astonished at all the people who work behind the counter at Shoppers Drug Mart or at the register of Sobeys. They're all showing up to work every day, like 9 to 5, because people need food. People need their prescriptions. They don't get paid very much. They don't have any investments. They didn't stock. The Wall Street can go up, down, and sideways. It doesn't matter. So to me, there was a real upswelling of, like, the decency of hard working people, and it really seemed, not everyone would necessarily agree, but it seemed to shine a light on the myth that the wealth of the world is somehow in the top tiers, because that actually seems to be an area where money makes money, and not there's no product, there's no hourly wage, and that world's just offline right now, and it doesn't seem to matter. And in fact, at least I am grateful to those who work this ordinary job at this ordinary wage to get ordinary goods to regular people, that are not stocks and bonds and so on. And Heart of Darkness is really the beginnings of modern, you're showing the effects of modern capitalism, because because of capitalism, imperialism suddenly makes sense. In other words, once your profit can become capital, and then you can build on that capital, and your capital can generate more capital, then you can go all the way to Africa and extract a resource, ivory in the case of Heart of Darkness, but it became rubber very shortly thereafter, not long after Conrad himself had been there. When he was there, but ivory wasn't doing that well. There was a sense that the Congo was probably going to be left alone, because they'd gotten all the ivory they could. The market was glutted in Europe, and ivory just wasn't bringing much in, even with free labor. Right around that time, 1900, was the beginnings of the automobile and the bicycle, of course, but the automobile even more. And what had limited the bicycle and the automobile, so that they'd been invented more or less, but they weren't very popular, is that they would rattle you. If you can imagine, early bicycles were just on steel, well, they weren't even steel, iron rims. So yeah, you could take a ride, but it would shake the teeth out of your head practically. And it was just as bad or worse with automobiles. And of course, with very early automobiles, there weren't modern roads. And then, so natural rubber was suddenly in huge demand, because people were trying to make tires. Because the so-called pneumatic tire, which is essentially a rubber tire that you can blow up with air, which we all know now, that changed everything. Bicycles weren't shaking you to pieces, nor were automobiles. But there was only natural rubber initially. So the demand for natural rubber just went through the roof. It was like gold. And all of a sudden, everybody was just flocking to the Congo, where the rubber trees grew, and they were just tapping these rubber trees, and the automobile was exploding, and roads were being built in town. I mean, it was changing everything. It was the internet of its time. Every age has different inventions that change everything: the automobile, the telephone, the telegraph, the airplane, the internet, the cell phone. These are all keep changing the world in different ways, but there's some commonalities. For instance, a cell phone and a telegram are 100 years apart, but the degree to which they both were brought into self-construction is comparable. So the importance of having your cell phone, and people saying, I left my cell phone at home. Oh my God, I don't know what to do. Just write me, and I'll try and get it to you. They panic if they lose a cell phone or leave it at home. I didn't have a cell phone until 2 years ago, and only then because my family bought it for me and said I had to carry it around in case I fell over or something. one of the indignities of old age. People seem very anxious to know when I fall over. I'm not sure why they're so sure I will. But so I said, whatever, give me the cell phone. I barely use it. I don't like it much. And the reason I never wanted a cell phone is that I knew that if I had a cell phone, people would call me, right? I mean, isn't that what happens? Or they'd text me, and then 2 minutes later, they'd be like, oh my God, you didn't answer my text. Are you dead? No, I don't care. It's like, I like to be where I am. And the cell phone is a distantiation device. And this isn't just a grumpy old guy talking, although maybe that too. But there's something about cell phones where you never are where you are because you're always wherever the damn cell phone is directing you, or where anytime people are like waiting to cross the street. They check their cell phones. Why don't you want to cross the street? Or they check their cell phones while they're crossing the street. And if a truck comes along, you're going to know where you are. But this kind of distantiation is really building on what we already saw in Dorian Gray, this need for otherness to shore up a sense of presentness, which isn't really presentness. So center yourself at the Scarborough Town Center and so on. Or go to the Araby Bazaar. Oh, we haven't read that story yet. When we get to Araby with James Joyce. But sorry, I was jumping ahead on that. But, Dorian Gray in chapter 11 has to buy stuff and more exotic stuff and just try and make himself feel better. So ideology, which is your imagined relationship to your actual existence, because your actual existence is inarticulate. Just going back to this point, there aren't words for it. And this is one reason that despite the avalanche of words at times in Heart of Darkness, most of the words are saying I can't describe what I'm trying to describe, and it just fails. Because there's something about the experience in the Congo that is beyond the hegemonic discourse of Europe. And it really kills Kurtz. Marlowe will say all of Europe went into the making of Kurtz. Yeah, and that wasn't enough to survive the Congo. And because everything that can't be explained in the Congo is the idea is, well, we will ignore it. We don't care about Africa, or even, and there wasn't even in Africa really, because that's a continent, and there was no sense of the individual, hundreds and hundreds of individual tribes in this place just called Africa, just so we'd have one name for the many different names. The Congo, none of these terms were indigenous to the area. They were carved out by the European powers, England, France. Belgium just managed to get a piece of the Congo, King Leopold, and so it was called the Belgian Congo. And mostly they gave it to Belgium because they didn't think that it would matter. But then it had the rubber, and automobiles took off, and suddenly King Leopold was sitting on a gold mine or a rubber mine. And it's that inability to encompass all that one sees that eats away at the Europeans in Africa. So even Kurtz, who sets off to write this book, and talk about arrogance, he sets off to write a book about how to suppress the vices of the savages or whatever, and he wants to write down all the, he said to us, to them we're God, and there's no limit to how much we can influence them. There's no limit to the good that we can do them. And I'll emphasize that. Kurtz didn't go there to destroy. He went there to have his ego flattered by what a god he would be, and he wasn't, and he knew, and as that became more and more apparent, he does almost the exact same thing that Dorian Gray does. Halfway through this historical record that he's writing, he scrawls, "Exterminate the brutes." Genocide. I mean, he can't get the tribes to fit his notion of what a god he is, and rather than, like Dorian Gray, rather than look at himself, he would them all to be destroyed. So he goes from wanting to help to enjoying being a god to being unable to tolerate the evidence that he's not, and then wanting to kind of prove that he is a god by using whatever power he initially thought he would use for good to exterminate them. And this happens a lot with utopias. Any of you have seen The Handmaid's Tale or know the novel in 1984. Utopias become vicious because they begin on this model of perfection, which sometimes is well-intentioned, and then reality starts to eat away at the corners of it, starts to impinge on it. There's problems with it, and the result of that is to push back ferociously against anything that doesn't conform to the original utopic vision. We'll see this with fascism later when we look at the rise of Nazis and World War II, and towards the end of this semester, where you begin with this new utopic concept of Germany in this case, white, Aryan, and then of course you have to start exterminating whatever doesn't conform to that, whether it's Jewish, homosexual, political dissidents, get carted off to camps and eliminated. So utopias, I mean, in a way, Dorian Gray is warning against utopias when he says to Lord Henry, there's a heaven and hell in each of us. So we're not utopic as people. And the idea that we can have a utopic culture almost always becomes vicious, because we just don't allow for the fact that we're capable of being very generous, we're capable of being very mean. And we don't always know why we're going to do one or the other. So to outlaw meanness, like Dr. Jekyll, is to just let Mr. Hyde take over. Because the more you deny and repress something, the greater its power. This is the essential dynamic of monster movies, that the more you lock the monster out, the more you discover it's already inside. I mean, this is a kind of the basic, almost every monster movie is like, can you keep the zombies out? Can you keep whatever it is out? And you can't. It's already in. There's a heaven and a hell in each of us. So monster movies, Jekyll and Hyde being one, we're exercising this old fantasy that we'll find the monstrous part of ourselves, we'll lock it outside, and we just won't let it in. We'll lock the windows, we'll lock the doors. It never works. It comes back in some other way, some other form. And that happened to Kurtz. I mean, he wanted to be just good. He wanted to be a Dr. Jekyll. He didn't want to, he rejected his Mr. Hyde side until by the time Marlowe finds him crawling on all fours after they're trying to get him out of the inner station. He's painted, and again, it's inarticulate. Marlowe can't even tell us, but he's doing some unspeakable rite. I don't know what it is. And Marlowe says to him, if you do this, you'll be lost, and somehow gets him back on the boat. But he's crawling around like an animal, and not because the so-called savages are animals, but because he's misconstrued their customs so much, and he's so anxious to be the leader of it all. And he, notice he's got the heads of people on spikes as Marlowe is coming into the inner station, and so why are those natives dead and others not? What was the distinction that Kurtz drew? And one gets the feeling that it was all about an increasingly violent and vicious attempt to promote selfhood, a selfhood that was eroding as fast as Kurtz could shore it up. Let me give you an example of one of the places where ideology is most dominant, and this isn't to say is advertising, and I'm not saying advertising is shaping you. It's hard to tell sometimes when something like advertising is influencing, remember Lord Henry in this regard, and when it's just reflecting symptomatically something that's already there. So I mentioned a deodorant called Sure in one of my earlier lectures, so we want certitude, so we have a deodorant called Sure. And most of we're constantly trying to shore up the self. So advertising is a really useful artifact for a cultural historian like me, because it's symptomatic of the deprivations we feel given the constructions of the self. There are a lot of deprivations. In fact, the self is actually a structure that is designed to feel deprived, because that's what gives it the energy to seek its compensation. The difficulty being that it can be fully compensated. So there is a constant fight of deprivation compensation. Kurtz goes to the Congo, which is, there's a lot of deprivation, there's a lot of hardship. He thinks he'll be compensated by bringing all this good, bringing all this light to the Congo. And what in his case, and this is an addiction, ritual as well. What happens is the compensation becomes less and less effective. The deprivation mounts. You seek even more compensation. Like he goes absolutely insane with the ivory. We find out from the Russian guy that he was about to shoot him because he had a piece of ivory under his pillow, and they had to give him that to not be killed. So at that point, it's almost like Kurtz is an opioid addict, like just stealing and looking for drugs under the couch and under the pillows. And so the self is an addictive structure. Nothing is ever going to be enough. And in fact, even the things it gets are less and less effective. And a lot of the literature we're reading is about trying to get a handle on that. Like, how can we come to ground? How can we step out of the compensation deprivation pendulum so we can figure out where we are when we're not either feeling deprived or feeling compensated? So when we're compensated, we're afraid of the next deprivation. And when we're deprived, we're searching for the next compensation. That's great for a consumer culture because we just swing back and forth. Work exhausts us, we go to the mall. We spend the money we got from the exhausting work. We have to go back to the exhausting work, so we go back to the mall because of the exhausting work. That's a little simplified, but it's a real basic structure, but it drives the machines, it drives the commodities. And the advertising is kind of the New Testament of all this stuff. It's the closest thing to religion or religious discourse that we have in this secular age. And it can get very sophisticated. It may not look it. When I was growing up, and I don't know if this is still a product, but there was a product called Whisk, which was a stain remover. And that's interesting in a lot of ways because having a stain on a white fabric is seen as a kind of injunction against whiteness. So we're very stain phobic as a culture. I mean, the difference between dirt and stain is a stain won't wash out. And when you think about it, soap operas, which became famous because they were selling soap, we are worried about stains a lot. And to have a stained shirt just before an interview, it's like a crisis because there's some sense of, I don't know, if we're stained, then we're not pure. And most people would freak out and try and change the shirt or cover it up, or instead of saying like, sorry, I spilled my coffee. So Whisk and all these different products, I mean, there's like 50,000 different versions of soap. I mean, there's even shampoo out of your hair. Like you use, I don't know, I don't even get it, but if you shampooed your hair too much, this will refresh it from the shampoo, and on and on. And there's conditioner, and there's this, and there's that, and it fluffs and it lightens, and on and on and on. And that's just personal hygiene soap. Then there's all the soaps that you can use for clothes. There's all the soaps you can use for your dishes, and they're all obsessed with perfection. No spots. Like even your wine glass has to come out of the dishwasher, and God forbid there's a spot on it. Then you've just got to like find the right soap, so there's not even a spot on your wine glass. And in this Whisk commercial, there were a lot of varieties of it, but the slogan at the time was ring around the collar. And the white collar of the man particularly was seen as an area where stains can happen. And it was the role of the wife in these commercials to get the stain out of their husband's collar. So this is early days. Feminism is not as organized a concept at this point. And everyone seems relatively comfortable with the fact that it's the job of the woman and the wife to keep the man's collar clean. So to try and sell this soap, this Whisk, one scenario is there's a man at what appears to be a business meeting. His wife is there too. The boss is there. You can see that they're like, oh boy, I hope I make a good impression on the boss. And then all of a sudden the boss sees his collar. Like the boss, that's what he does. He goes around looking at people's collars. And his voice, his godlike voice, comes out of nowhere and says, ring around the collar. And then the commercial does a close-up of the woman's face, and she looks awful. It's all her fault. And then they show Whisk, and then they show her at home, and then they show the collar, and this time it's clean, and there's no more ring around the collar, and it's like redemptive or something. And even as a kid, I remember thinking, okay, so she can scrub away at this collar night and day and live in perpetual fear of some shadow being visible to someone important to her husband, or her husband could wash his neck. Uh, she has to somehow be between his neck and his collar. So there's clearly a feminist point to be made here. When you're responsible for someone else's dirt, your own agency is significantly reduced. But there's also, like, in order for him to get a job, in order for him to get a promotion so they can have maybe a second car or a bigger house, it all comes down to soap. Um, and just notice this as you go around in your day, like how often soap is sold trying to use the anxiety um, of making progress in your career, in your romantic relationships, even in your children, and whether they love you enough or not. So, Downy softener will have whatever that is, that water softener. Kid comes home. I remember this ad and says, "How come my towels don't smell like Tony's towels? My friend down the street." And the mother looks awful. Like, my children don't love me. I failed them as a mother. My towels smell weird. Why is this kid smelling his friend's towels? Is something I'm curious about. I mean, he goes over to his friend's house and just heads for the linen closet, and then so it doesn't actually make any sense. But it's weird how we don't even notice how odd it is. Because then the Downy fabric softener comes in, and now his towels smell as good as Tony's, and she's a good mother, and her children love her, and they won't grow up to be serial killers, and everybody's happy. This is just so, but this is how hegemonic discourse works. There is this presumptive ideal of a superior whiteness that nobody can reach, including so-called white people. But it doesn't, that's not the point. The point is to set up whiteness as a hierarchically superior to quote unquote blackness or brownness or yellowness or any sub-white. And the other place where you see this acting out is skin lightening products. Fair and Lovely comes to mind. Many of you may know that. You can see the ads on YouTube. They're not even subtle. You lost the interview because your skin was too dark. Then you use Fair and Lovely, and you get the interview, or you get the date, and there's a version of it in the Asian culture, and there's a version of it in the culture of India. And it's a complete buy-in to this hierarchy that literally the shade of your skin going from dark to light is a marker of your potential for happiness, for success, for advancement. And this is also how the hegemonic discourse locks out other alternatives, because the hegemonic discourse sets the horizon of what can be allowed, what can be seen and known and heard, and what can't. And somehow, once you set up that horizon, that skin tone is an indicator of worth, even though there's no connection, zero. Then people absorb that somehow, and they begin to feel like, what am I going to do? I can't get ahead if my skin tone is this and not that. And it's not the skin tone, but they're also not wrong, because the entire culture buys into this preference for whiteness. So you didn't get the job because your skin was just too dark. Yes and no. I mean, of course, that's not why. But it's also could be a fact that in the interview, the person before you had the lighter skin and they get the job, especially if it involves some kind of public service. And the company's not going to say anything. They're not going to say, sorry, your skin's too dark. And that's why racism uses markers which are almost impossible to hide. Like, racism isn't based on the shape of your feet, because then you'd have to have an interview with a guy that said, okay, there's just one more thing we got to do before I decide whether to give you this job, and I'll take you off your shoes and socks, and let's just see what kind of feet you have. It'd be like, well, that's feetist or racist somehow. But if it's your face, if it's your nose, your lips, your eyes, your hair, they don't have to say they're racist. They just note it and then come up with some other reason for putting you aside. So to go back to Heart of Darkness because I'm conscious of the time. You'll notice in the text that I've given you that I suggest that there are 9 encounters where we see this binary that I've been trying to uh, to set forth. Um, you'll notice from the graph I gave you last lecture, that the age of faith is about counting, the age of anxiety is about accounting, and the age of depression, or the age of the economy, which is, I talk more about it in A11, but I think we're kind of in it now, is the age of the algorithm, the bot, the automatic. So you go from counting, like well, 1 is 1, to accounting, where you can do very creative accounting so that you can maximize profit and relative to taxes. And then you get to algorithms where there is the selling and the accounting, if you will, is automatic. The ads that show up on my Facebook scroll are somehow generated by the sum total of my clicks. I don't know what it is about my clicks, but my Facebook profile is basically my Mr. Hyde, as far as I can tell. It always says things like, your criminal record can still be expunged. What, is this because I Googled existentialism? I mean, my Google record probably is weird. So my Facebook ad scroll doesn't know what to make of me. I seem to be a mild-mannered maniac. But that's okay. I take comfort from the fact that they've obviously never met me. So Marlowe's first encounter is when he goes to get the job. And I'll just read a little bit from Heart of Darkness itself to give you a sense of how Conrad sets up Marlowe's narration. In the outer room, the 2 women knitted black wool feverishly. Often far away, there I thought of these 2 guarding the door of darkness, knitting black wool as for a warm pall, which is what you put over a corpse, one introducing continuously to the unknown, the other scrutinizing the cheery and foolish faces with unconcerned old eyes. Old knitter of black wool. Not many of those she looked at ever saw her again, not half, by a long way. So set up at the very beginning of this is that as you move toward the Congo, there's already a sense of premonition of disaster. Women with black wool knitting, cutting it off. This goes all the way back to Greek myth. And really, he gets this premonition over and over again, even in this very first encounter, that there's a certain madness to heading out to the other side. The next thing, the doctor measures his head and says, I'm just trying to figure out what kind of people go out there. And he said, but I don't know why bother measuring the head, because the changes happen inside. And that becomes a major theme of the novel. Is it people who think they know they are who they are? They don't just literally get lost, although that can happen. Psychologically, they get lost. They lose their bearings. They lose their orientation. Everything they thought they knew about that made them who they think they are is not. There's nothing fortifying it in what the place that they're going into, except making money. So mostly they want to make money and get out before they fall apart, either through malaria or through psychological breakdown. The changes take place inside. I felt very annoyed, Marlowe says. Is that question in the interest of science too? It would be, he said, without taking notice of my irritation. Interesting for science to watch the mental changes of individuals on the spot. But, and he goes on, I can't do that. All I can do is measure your head. There's a moment here where you see the limitations of science and measuring versus these psychological changes that will occur apart from any possible scientific inquiry. The second encounter, I suppose, is when he sees his first sight of 6 natives chained together walking by. A slight clinking behind me made me turn my head. 6 black men advanced in a file, toiling up the pass. I could see every rib. The joints of their limbs were like knots into rope. Each had an iron collar on his neck. All were connected to the chain. Another report from the cliff made me think suddenly of the ships of war I had seen firing into a continent. It was the same kind of ominous voice, but these men could by no stretch of imagination be called enemies. They were called criminals. And the outraged law, like the bursting shells, had come to them, an insoluble mystery from the sea. This earlier he'd seen a ship that was simply bombing, just pushing missiles into the brush, and you couldn't even see what they were firing at or what result it had. Then he sees them blowing up the mountains, puffs of smoke, rock flying, not really making a huge impression on the landscape, and again, not making a lot of sense of what it is they were trying to do. But then he gets down to the language. These men have been chained up because they're called criminals, which means they're not doing what they've been told for free. And then they're called enemies, which means that their criminal behavior is threatening the enterprise of the myth of enlightenment and progress and efficiency and innovation that is going forward. So this is the power of language, especially in hegemonic discourse. Who do you get to call enemy? Who do you get to call criminal? We see these terms thrown around. Terrorist, Antifa is the latest. Is everybody Antifa? What is Antifa? Is anything to Antifa? And it's this labeling. If it's labeling is a really convenient way to provide an alibi for perpetuating violence against a group. You simply label them enemies, you label them criminals, and then you can go in and beat them up, arrest them, tear gas, whatever, rubber bullets. Rubber is pretty ironic in this context. Notice, as I said in my text here, notice how many binaries are established. Man versus animals, enemies versus allies, criminals versus law-abiders, savage versus civilized folks. And when he sees the people who are driving these natives forward, we get the first clear example of how this is modern pillage. This is not like the way the Romans used to do it, and that's partly how Marlowe had begun, by saying that the Romans, they pillaged, but they didn't make up lies about it. They just came into town and they took because they could. And if you'd ask them, what are you doing? They'd be like, well, I'm taking all this stuff. And you'd be like, why? And they'd be, well, because I can. There's something much worse about having this ideology that you're looting and pillaging and raping and killing, and that it's good, that these people should appreciate it. There's an added violence to that that's unique and modern, and important to this course in that sense is the bureaucracy of the bureaucratization of violence. And Marlowe says, I've seen the devil of violence and the devil of greed and the devil of hot desire, but by all the stars, those were strong, lusty, red-eyed devils that swayed and drove men, I tell you. So he's not really condoning that, but at least he's saying these guys went for it. They put themselves out there, and they were devils and vicious and dangerous. But what freaks him out about this is these guys are just bureaucrats. As I stood on the hillside, I foresaw that in the blinding sunshine of that land, I would become acquainted with a flabby, pretending, weak-eyed devil of a rapacious and pitiless folly. How insidious he could be, too, I was only to find out several months later, and 1,000 miles farther. For a moment I stood appalled, as though by a warning. And of course, it is a warning, excuse me. It's that flabby, pretending, weak-eyed devil. That there's a disconnect here between the violence being perpetuated and the kind of flabby, inconsiderate, unaware people who are performing it. One of the bonuses, if you will, of innovation is that weak-minded and weak-bodied and weak-willed people can yield enormous leverage in this continent far away. Another encounter is when he sees the dying natives in the groves, and again he hears the report of yet more dynamite going off. The work was going on, the work, and this was the place where some of the helpers had withdrawn to die. They were dying slowly. It was very clear. They were not enemies. They were not criminals. They were not earthly, now nothing but black shadows of disease and starvation lying confusedly in the greenish gloom, brought from all the recesses of the coast in all the legality of time contracts. That's just pay attention to that, and this how often is this horrible, horrific scene. It's legal, and these natives were said to have signed contracts, and they were said to be paid. They were paid with copper wire and things that were just pointless. Um, but it was all legal. It was every contracts had been signed, and that is a premonition that will get worse and worse. The extent to which bureaucracy, like other things, can be used to imprison and eliminate as much as it can to organize. So they were lost in uncongenial surroundings, fed unfamiliar food. They sickened, became inefficient, and were then allowed to crawl away and die. This yoking of a very innocent, well, it's something like inefficient. I mean, it doesn't sound that ominous. And to link inefficiency with death is this is where Conrad's genius comes into play. I mean, we now have to be efficient, and being efficient means we have to do more and more with less and less. And I think a lot of you guys know this. You know what your schedule's like. You know, you may be trying to do a job. You may be trying to come to class. You may be trying to keep up with reading. You're worried about your grades. You're worried about a grad school that the grades will determine. You're worried about getting through that. You're worried about parents, siblings, who's sacrificing for you. It can squeeze you and snap you like a twig if you're not careful. And it's about efficiency, which seems strange because that's like doesn't sound like a violent word, but efficiency can be very violent, and it can be violent when you are just terrified that if you don't do more with less, you'll be eliminated. I don't mean you'll be killed, but it can get that bad. You might be fired, or you might be demoted, or you might disappoint people, or your grade might suffer, things like that. But it's all a gradation that can, and what was so shocking about the Congo for Marlowe and what destroyed Kurtz was they saw how far efficiency could go all the way up to a kind of mass murder. Not a murder of people walking up and shooting people in the head, but a murder of working. It was cheaper to work people till they died and replace them than to pay any attention to the quality of their work environment so that they could continue to work. Now, you can't get away with that as a rule. I mean, you can't just hire people and say work 24 hours a day until you drop dead, and then I'll just find someone else. Although one has to be careful because technically capitalism and contracts don't say you can't do that. You have to push back if you can. But there's always that problem of if you won't do the job, the person behind you will. And we can do a lot of damage to ourselves trying desperately to stay in the running at our own expense. It's a very, very difficult in modernity to self-care, to truly self-care, not pursue these things that actually don't make you feel better. They just say they will. So let me just jump to the third encounter, and this is the accountant, sort of Mr. Clean. I met a white man in such an unexpected elegance of get-up that in the first moment I took him for a sort of vision. And the whiteness is a vision. It's a hallucination of superiority. I saw a high starched collar, white cup. It's a miracle. And it does remind me of the Mr. Clean commercials. And why does it not surprise housewives when the 8-foot tall, blinding white bald guy shows up next to them? And it's like, hi. What? And then he gives them I don't know, the Mr. Clean. Who the hell is Mr. Clean? He's some kind of vision of whiteness. I shook hands with this miracle and learned he was the company's chief accountant. And there's this wonderful scene, horrible and wonderful scene later, where the accountant is trying to write down his figures, and there's a guy behind him that's literally dying and moaning in pain as he dies. And the accountant is annoyed, saying, how am I supposed to get this accounting right with this moaning going on behind me? And this is presented as the same thing. This is, I mean, the giving over to the accounting, like it's more important to get these numbers straight than that this poor SOB behind me is drawing his last breath, and that's normal. I mean, the way things get normalized, hegemonic discourse can normalize horrific things. So that things but what happens with Marlowe and Kurtz to an extent is they get plunged into it too fast. Like they don't have time to normalize. I'm not sure how long this accountant has been there. And he says, I've been teaching one of the native women about the station. It was difficult. She had a distaste for the work. And how is that distaste beaten out of her? The violence disappears into the euphemisms. Thus, the man had verily accomplished something, and he was devoted to his books, which were in apple pie order. In some ways, Dorian Gray's charm to people is that he seems perfectly white, perfectly charming, perfectly handsome, no stain, no blemish. And the accountant says, the groans of this sick person distract my attention, and without that, it is extremely difficult, his attention, to guard against clerical errors. In this climate, dying people threaten efficiency, but efficiency is killing the people who are dying. When one has got to make correct entries, he says, one comes to hate these savages, hate them to death. So that's a little like Kurtz's exterminate the beasts. And capitalism is very good at drawing your attention to just accumulation at any cost, and the ends justify the means. There's Marlowe's encounter with the manager and with the manager's assistant. And that's when he discovers something weird, that his aunt, who got him the job, had talked to one of the higher people in the company and had said, or the head of the company had said, that he was like Kurtz. And he has no clue, but now he realizes why everyone seems weirdly afraid of him, because he's the new Kurtz, they think, because they're constantly eavesdropping and just all trying to get an edge on each other. So I'm conscious of time here, so I want to get toward the really the final encounter. So we have the Russian sailor, and the way the company doesn't care at all about Kurtz's dying condition. They're just, what's up with the ivory? But this is what Kurtz has become, as Marlowe reports it. Now remember, Marlowe's been dying to meet Kurtz the whole way up, because he's decided in his own mind, talk about myth of progress, that this horribleness that he's seeing will be explained by Kurtz somehow. Because all he ever hears is Kurtz is amazing. His talking is amazing. You just listen to him all day. And we never hear anything Kurtz says, really, by the time the novel's over. But Marlowe puts all his hope that Kurtz will have some amazing explanation for why this all ultimately makes some kind of sense. And when he finally meets Kurtz, here's what we get. You should have heard him say, my ivory. Oh, yes, I heard him. My intended, my ivory, my station, my river, my everything belonged to him. But that was a trifle. The thing was to know what he belonged to. You can't understand. How could you? He's talking to the sailors that are listening to his story. With solid pavement under your feet, surrounded by kind neighbors ready to cheer you. These little things make all the great difference. When they are gone, you must fall back on your own innate strength, upon your own capacity for faithfulness. So the irony here is he's suggesting that this concrete, solid pavement under your feet is an illusion, even though it's concrete and it's under your feet. That all of us have no idea how vulnerable we are to falling apart if all of the things that shore up our ideologies were to be stripped away. And those of us that when they're not likely to be stripped away in one fell swoop. But this class and literature and art is often an invitation to examine some of the ideologies in case they're constricting you, and you decide to alter them. So ideology is your imagined relationship to actual existence, but it also protects you from actual existence, as it did Dorian Gray, as it did Kurtz. Marlowe suffers horribly this whole novel, but he's intact at the end, partly because he, not always voluntarily, submitted to the suffering and didn't hide behind an illusion. He didn't become comfortably numb. He didn't go with opium. And ideology is a kind of opium that can be used to numb things, so that the things you see in front of you, you adopt an ideology that makes them okay. And that's one reason people can be so, political arguments can get so edgy so fast, because you're quickly moving to a point where the other person's ideology or yours is being threatened. And it's like there's a dam, and behind that dam is this massive water of those elements of existence that you don't want to deal with. And this other person is saying, let's just put a crack in that dam. Let's just let this through. And you're like, no. And you can fight about political leaders or political ideas, but you're fighting to keep your dam intact against a wall of an unacknowledged reality, of a real that is beyond the capacity of your reality to acknowledge. I think I said that right. And where this all comes to a final moment is when Marlowe goes to see Kurtz's intended, Kurtz's fiance. And this is why I have the Apocalypse Now clip of the Playboy bunnies being helicoptered in to entertain the American soldiers fighting in Vietnam. The women are also asked to perform a function for the ideology. Now, Marlowe says the women are out of it. They should be out of it. They're well out of it. That's the way it should be. But that's Marlowe. It's not Conrad. I mean, Marlowe got his job from a woman. And there's an African mistress who is featured at a crucial point that had something to do with Kurtz. We're not sure what. And then there's Kurtz's intended. And the women, the European women, are in a way are asked to launder the stain out of imperialism. So when you look at the intended's drawing room, there's a great moment where he notices the ivory keys of the piano. So somehow that ivory, which he now has seen all too well, which the misery, the death that is brought to get that ivory to Europe, now it's a piano key. So you can go from condemning 5 million natives to an excruciating death, and you wind up with a product on which you can play Mozart, you can play, an aria, you can play Chopin and beautiful music. And it's not that the intended's a horrible person who doesn't care, but they don't. And I think that's part of what Marlowe says, but they may not realize it, is that it's important that women not be asked to know what's going on in the Congo, because their job is to make it all seem right. And that's going to be really hard to do if they actually saw what Marlowe saw. And that's what it comes down to, is he's gone back. What is Marlowe doing? He prefers Kurtz to the company, because despite the terrible things Kurtz did, he went out there with some intent, and he was destroyed. And he destroyed a lot of things. But he's still not as bad to Marlowe as the accountants. That's the people who just count this stuff, don't see anything. Don't confront it, don't experience it, don't have any emotions about it. And I think one of the reasons he doesn't have to go see the intended. He brings her Kurtz's papers, and he seems to want to. He wants to do something for Kurtz, I think, but I don't think he knows what. And he is both, I think, heartened and depressed by how she seems to be preparing to mourn Kurtz's death the rest of her life somehow. Like he was the great, great emissary. He was the future of civilization in Africa, and he has died in that pursuit, and it was a noble pursuit, and there's just no question. And he's in a terrible position, because he sort of thought it might be true, but now he knows it wasn't. Kurtz died saying the horror. And this is wonderfully written, this final scene, and Conrad agonized over it. She also seems like an angel of whiteness. I mean, she just floats in a white cloud. And Marlowe has said all along he hates lies, and yet he's about to tell a huge lie, because he's confronted, and he stumbles into it without meaning to. And she says, well, so you knew him? And he's like, yeah. And you were there with him at the end. Uh, here's the way she puts it. Forgive me, says the intended. I I have mourned so long in silence, in silence. You were with him to the last. I think of his loneliness. Nobody near to understand him as I would have understood. Perhaps no one to hear. To the very end, I said shakily. I heard his very last words. I stopped in a fright because Marlowe realizes what he's just done. He did hear his last words, the horror, and now he's said that, and who is not going to say, what were they? So in his efforts to comfort her, he stumbled into a trap of his own making. Repeat them, she said in a heartbroken tone. I want something to, to live with. I was on the point of crying at it. Don't you hear them? The dusk was repeating them in a persistent whisper all around us, in a whisper that seemed to swell menacingly like the first rising of a wind. The horror, the horror. His last word to live with, she murmured. Don't you understand? I loved him. I loved him. I loved him. I pulled myself together and spoke slowly. The last word he pronounced was your name. I heard a light sigh, and then my heart stood still, stopped dead short by an exulting and terrible cry. That was what the African mistress did too. By the cry of inconceivable triumph and of unspeakable pain. I knew it. I was sure. And Marlowe says to himself, she knew. She was sure, like the dealer. But she doesn't know. He's left her. He's left her ideology intact. His own ideology's been shredded, and he leaves hers intact. It's a great ending because it's hard to pin it down. Like, was this good? Was this bad? Was this wrong? Was this right? Was he being kind to her by lying to her and telling her what she was sure she knew? Should he have said? Actually, he said the horror in his life. He died in the sense that the entire thing was awful and pointless. Would that have killed this fiance? Has he done something worse by entombing her in her own certitude that he was everything she imagined him to be, and therefore worthy of her devoting? I don't know whether she'll ever get married or even consider it. She seems to see herself now as a statue for in his honor. So Marlowe shores up her false certitude. She knew, she was sure, and uh, your reading of this ending, it's like a lot of the literature that we're reading. It's precisely the ambiguity that is. How do you? And when you look at the Playboys coming, and they're dressed as cowboys and Indians, and they're using rifles in these incredibly phallic ways and sexually suggestive ways until the men just surge onto the stage, and they have to tear gas them and get the Playboy bunnies back in the helicopter and just go again. And in the voiceover, Willard, it was the Marlowe figure, says Charlie didn't get much. USO, Charlie being the Vietnamese. He was dug in too deep or moving too fast. His idea of great rest and relaxation was cold rice and a little rat meat. He had only two ways home: death or victory. So in his voiceover, Willard thinks about the Vietnamese army that they're trying to fight, who aren't getting this ideology. You're fighting for these women, you're fighting for Miss December, and Miss November, and Miss October, and they are drawn to you because of your military prowess. And the Vietnam War was highly commercial. I mean, it was a pushback. It was an attempt to open a further market and also to limit the spread of the Russian economy. So I have to draw things to a close. I'm going to offer up now that I've done this lecture, an extra credit assignment where I'll give you an extra point on the midterm, and if you complete the assignment, it's voluntary, and it's mostly a completion credit. Like you're going to get it if you do it. But what you got to do is find an ad think illustrates one of the Pepsi myths: progress, efficiency, perfection, satisfaction, innovation, and try and tie it into ending of Heart of Darkness. In what way is this ad lying to us? In what way is this ad saying the final words are not the horror? The final words are our name. If you're looking for perfection, as I said, look at cosmetic ads. If you want the myth of innovation, look at automobile ads. If you want progress, look at wealth management ads. Satisfaction tends to be electronic consumer products, Alexa, Apple Watch, said most of them, but and there's a lot of overlap. So you might literally see the word perfection. You probably will if you look very far, or progress. The word doesn't have to be there, but see if you can make that case. What I'll do is I'll put a discussion prompt, saying extra point midterm, and I'll just outline what I just said. Maybe even give you an example of my own. And I would like you to attach the ad now. And granted, I'm interested in the ads you might come up with, because I have tons of ads, but I like to refresh them. So if you do a cool ad that I like, then I'll be able to bring it forward. So that's it for now. We'll be turning our attention to Dubliners, James Joyce, for next week. I'll also see whoever wants to see me this Wednesday at 11 for the open classroom. Do bring your questions, and if there are passages that you want me to elucidate further and so on. If there aren't, it's all right. I'll pull out some quotes. But I'll always be. I'm anxious. I'm happy to be interrupted in this open classroom. I don't want to just give another hour lecture. I'd like to talk about things that are on your mind, and not just my guess at what you need to know. All right. So in the meantime, well, we're done for now, and I will see you, at least some of you, this coming Wednesday at 11. Bye for now.